Dylan approach as well. Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution and your talk. Okay, now we are going to move to the first invited speaker. Peter, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
Francisco. Let me start my video as well.
Sure. Nice to see you here. Well, you can take control. You can maybe share your slide anytime you want. I'm gonna make you a brief introduction.
Okay, thanks.
About you. Meanwhile, you take control. Okay. So, well, so the next talk is from Peter Vamplew. Peter Vamplew is an associate professor in Federation University, Fed Unit here in Ballarat. He's the leader of the FLAC research team. He has been researching in reinforcement learning area for many years, actually, particularly in multi-objective reinforcement learning. So yeah, thank you very much, Peter, for accepting our invitation. So it's all yours.
And thanks very much, Francisco, and the other organisers for inviting me. I'll just start with a brief apology. It's been a very busy week and I haven't had as much time to fine tune these slides as I'd hoped. So basically I've got slides taken from some longer presentations and I'm just going to skip over some of the details to try and stay within the time limit. Hopefully I have some time for questions at the end, and if anyone wants to explore those details, we can talk about them then. As Francisco says, we've been looking at multi-objective reinforcement learning for a bit over a decade now, and probably about 4 or 5 years ago we started to realize that this had some potential application in the areas of human-aligned AI. And so today's talk's really summarising the thoughts we've had around that area and a bit of the experimental work that we've done over the last year. So quick overview, basically I want to talk a bit about what sort of factors we might be interested in taking into account for human alignment and how we might go about defining them in terms of rewards for human aligned RL. And then look at what happens if you try to then take those rewards and apply conventional single objective, scalar reward reinforcement learning to that, and explain why we don't think that's suitable, why we think that may fail to find suitable solutions. And then talk a bit about, at a general level, why multi-objective rewards might be beneficial and how you might actually implement multi-objective reinforcement learning. So that work comes from primarily this paper we published back in 2018. And then more recently, that was a fairly theoretical paper. More recently, we finally managed to finish off a bit of empirical experimental work, putting some of these ideas into practice. So for the second half of the talk, I want to talk about that example. And so this is specifically looking at applying some of the multi-objective RL techniques to create safety-aware AI. And that, the full details of that one are in this paper that was just published a couple of months ago. And so I'd just like to thank at this point, my co-authors, Richard Daisley, who's talking a bit later tonight, Cameron Foll, Adam Bignold, Sally Furman, and Jane Murray. Okay, so first of all, why do I think we need some sort of constrained RL in order to get human-aligned behaviour? And I'm, I guess, preaching a bit to the converted here, given that you're attending this human-aligned RL workshop. Of course, RL agents are based on this idea of maximising their expected rewards. So you give them a reward signal, they select actions that maximise that. The problem here is that the agents are actually very effective at maximising the reward that they're given, and that's not necessarily always going to result in the optimal behaviour. If the reward signal we've got is not perfectly aligned with the actual behaviour we want from the agent, it's possible they'll find a behaviour that does a great job of maximising the reward, but produces outcomes that aren't necessarily any near what we actually want. Good example that was in the literature a couple of years ago. This was from work done at OpenAI. They were applying RL in the context of some video games. One of the ones they looked at was this Coast Runners game, which it's basically a racing game with boats. The aim is to obviously complete laps of this circuit as fast as you can and hopefully finish first in the race. But the reward signal they were using was based just on the in-game score, which rewards you for collecting objects as you go around the track. Now, when you collect an object, it disappears. And so the thinking is, if you play like a normal person would, you collect one object, you move on to the next one, and so on, which leads you around the track, and ideally as quickly as possible, and you win the race. Now, what happened in practice was that their agent found a location where there were 3 barrels positioned so that it could collect them in a sequence. It would fly around, it would bounce off some of these walls of the jetty here, burst into flames, but then come back around and collect the barrels just as they appeared again, which was enough to put the fire out for a while, and then it would bounce off the walls, catching flames, and just got stuck in a loop here, going round and round in circles, not getting anywhere near actually completing the race, but of course it was actually maximizing its score. And so that's the sort of problem we have, that potentially quite unsafe behavior that's not aligned with what we want it to achieve, might come about from what seemed to be a reasonably correct reward signal. The other analogy I like for this is the Sorcerer's Apprentice, the old Disney movie. So here you've got, Mickey Mouse enchants the broom to fetch water for him so that he doesn't have to do it himself, but he doesn't place any constraints on the broom. And so it winds up creating duplicates of itself, which continue collecting water. There's nothing telling them to stop once the basin is full. And so pretty soon the whole place is flooded and it's an absolute disaster. And so this is what can happen if you start applying reinforcement learning, maximizing a simple reward signal. You're potentially going to run into these sort of problems. How might we get around that? Well, let's, instead of just having a simple reward, let's build more complicated rewards that reflect other factors that we care about. So if we want ethical behavior from our agents, we want them to follow the same sort of ethical rules that people do, we've got to define what those ethical frameworks are. So utilitarianism is one of the ones that's commonly been discussed in the HARL literature because it's a quantitative approach. We have some sort of measure of utility that we're trying to maximize. So Jeremy Bentham suggested it's a sum of the happiness of the population, however you measure that. And so you can obviously quite easily express that as a reward because it's a quantitative value. You add that on to whatever other sort of reward signals you would normally have to the agent, and hopefully it takes these ethical framework into account, as well as trying to maximize its regular score. Not as straightforward as it might be, because how do you measure utility? What utility measure is correct? There's been lots and lots of possibilities proposed over the years. No real obvious answer. So maybe you actually have to build in multiple utilitarian frameworks, lots of different reward signals, with the hope that compromising between all of them gives you the sort of behavior you want. Other types of ethical frameworks, people have looked at sort of deontological ethics. So this is not so much outcome driven as saying, there are fixed rules, there are things you should do and you shouldn't do. And we want our agent to follow those rules as well. Now, you might be able to define these as rewards still to make them suitable for reinforcement learning. You just give a penalty term if an action conflicts with these duties. So there's a duty associated with fidelity, basically being true to your friends and family. So if we carry out any sort of action that would have a negative effect in that sense, we give a negative reward. Moving beyond ethical frameworks, we might want to ensure our agents follow legal frameworks. So we want them to obey the law. If this is a self-driving car, we want it to follow the speed limit. We don't want it endangering other people. So we could define penalties for actions which break the law, and maybe we weigh them up. So if it's a severe offence, one that would carry a large penalty for a human, give a large negative reward for the agent for doing that. Now, this is going to be a little tricky because, of course, we can't necessarily always follow the law. Sometimes the right thing to do is to break that law. If I need to cross a white line marked on the road in order to avoid a traffic accident, I'm going to do that, even though it's technically an illegal action. Other things we might consider if we're building military agents, hopefully we're not, but if we are, there are the laws of war, the rules of engagement that govern the behavior of human soldiers. You would hope that your military robots or other types of autonomous systems would follow those same laws. And again, these can potentially be quantified and expressed as rewards and penalties. More generally, we might care about things like safety. And this is one of my own main areas of focus. So we want to make sure that whatever the AI does doesn't pose undue safety risks for humans. So various aspects that have been looked at in here. One is this concept of corrigibility. So basically, if we make a mistake, if the agent starts behaving in a fashion that we realize is unsafe and we want to stop it, it complies with us trying to stop it. And that's potentially a problem because, of course, if you're telling the agent to maximize its reward, if I stop it, it doesn't get any more reward. And so there's sort of a built-in incentive for it to not listen to me or, to actually actively prevent me from trying to turn it off. Another area that's been proposed in this sort of area is this concept of impact minimization. So the idea here is we try and give the agent, I guess, a bit of common sense that while you're carrying out your task, don't change things in the environment unless you have to. So if I tell you to vacuum the floor, don't smash up all the furniture and throw it out the window to make it easier to vacuum the floor. If you need to, move the furniture to the side, vacuum, and then put it back again. Try to avoid permanent changes to the environment. Other things we care about in alignment frameworks that are perhaps a little harder to represent directly as rewards, although we would argue that they're still, multi-objective approaches are still very relevant here, are things like trust and explainability. Unfortunately for me, I don't need to talk about them because Richard Daisley is giving the presentation a little bit later, and he's going to focus particularly on that relationship between multi-objective agents and explainability. Okay, so let's say we've decided the alignment framework or frameworks that we care about. We've worked out a way of representing them as a reward, and now we want to train a reinforcement learning agent on those rewards. Now, of course, standard approach in reinforcement learning is we give the agent a reward, which is just a scalar value at any point in time. And so if we've defined multiple sources of reward here, so we've got rewards associated with our primary task, like maximizing your score or cleaning as much of the floor with the vacuum as possible. And we've also got some rewards associated with these various alignment properties that we care about. How do we give that information to the agent? Well, in conventional reinforcement learning, basically what we do is we just take all those different forms of reward, we add them all up, and then we just give that resulting scalar value to the agent. And there's a bit of an assumption, if you look at the conventional reinforcement learning literature, that this is going to work. That if there are multiple things we care about, we can get an appropriate trade-off between them just by adding together these different reward components. You might want to introduce some sort of weighting factor. So if there's something I care about more than another factor, I give it a larger weighting. But even that is not necessarily going to give us the trade-off that we want. And essentially, there's two issues here. One is that finding the correct weighting to get the required balance between these two factors, or many factors possibly, is going to be difficult. If you've got, say, a self-driving vehicle, now I've got a reward for my primary task, which is probably get me to the destination as quickly as you can. And then I've got alignment rewards as well. So main one presumably would be, don't hurt anyone, don't hurt me, don't hurt the passengers, don't hurt anyone outside the vehicle. And maybe also some other alignment rewards. There might be legal frameworks being built in here as well. Don't speed. Now, if I apply a weighting to these, or if the scale of these rewards is defined in such a way that the primary reward is too large relative to the alignment reward, the vehicle's probably pretty much going to ignore that alignment reward and drive unsafely, just get to the destination as quickly as it can. On the other hand, if my alignment reward is too large or too heavily weighted, the vehicle might not even start. It might say, look, the only safe thing for me is to just stay still in the garage, because as soon as I go on the road, there's a slight risk that I'm going to get in an accident and hurt someone. So that's a problem, and you might have to fine tune quite a bit before you find an appropriate set of weightings that's going to trade off those rewards correctly. More generally, and more fundamentally an issue, is there may simply be, sorry, let's skip 2 slides. Let me go back a bit. Let's just go forward. I'm saying going backwards. Sorry, that's where I meant to be. There may actually be no weighting that will give you the desired behavior once you scalarize your rewards in this way. So here's an example from that theoretical paper of ours. So here we're looking at a medical sort of scenario. So we want the patient to comply with some sort of treatment because it's going to minimize their condition, be best for their health. But on the other hand, we want them to maintain their sense of autonomy. We don't want the robot pinning them to a bed each day so it can give them the injections or force the tablets down their throat. So we've got a set of possible policies the agent might be following, represented by these blue dots. And we want to find one of those that gives us the best possible trade-off. And let's say, for this particular situation, this is the policy we like. We would like to have policy A3. Problem we've got here is that there's no set of weights, or there's no linear weights that will actually select A3. It doesn't matter what sort of weights you put into this system, either, in this case, A2 or A1 are always going to be optimal because of this concave shape of our Pareto front in this case. And so there's a fundamental limitation that scalarization of multiple factors into a single reward is inherently not able to find some of the solutions that we might want to find. So what we want to do is to instead use multi-objective methods. So everyone's already familiar with your standard model here of the reinforcement learning agent interacting with the environment by executing actions, getting back rewards. And generally, the assumption is that reward here is a scalar value. Now, multi-objective RL, we're just going to say, okay, that's a vector instead. This seems like a simple thing. It throws up a whole bunch of complications in terms of the algorithms. And I can't possibly go into them in the time I've got today. So if you want to know more about that, a couple of papers here that, again, fair warning, I was involved in these. There's a survey we wrote back in 2013, and we've got a practical guide currently under review, hopefully about to be resubmitted and accepted and published, but you can get a preprint from archive. Okay, so basically what we've got now is that our agent is receiving a vector value back, and it's got to somehow choose actions that will result in the optimal policy, the optimal trade-off between those objectives that we care about. And I think I'll skip this next slide because I think I'm taking a bit too long. Let's go back to this example from before. So I've got multiple policies my agent might follow. How do I choose one of those? And there's various approaches that have been used here. So we're assuming now that the agent has a vector representation of these rewards internally. And essentially we just need to do something non-linear that will let us choose any of these 5 solutions. So one approach that people have used is Chebyshev distance. So you define kind of an optimal point. I'd like to be as close to this as possible. For each policy, you basically just measure its distance, its deviation from that optimal point, and then you choose the one which is closest, which in this particular case would be policy A3, the one that I said a linear method couldn't find. Other ways we could do this, an approach that we've done quite a bit of work with is a combination of ordering or prioritization of objectives combined with thresholding. So in this case, we might say, I care quite a bit about autonomy. I want to make sure that the patient has a reasonable level of autonomy. So I'm going to set some sort of threshold here, in this case about 0.6, and I only want to consider solutions that are above that threshold. So that's immediately going to rule out these options down here. And then of the ones that are above that threshold, I'm going to pick the one that is best with regards to our other objective, the compliance with the medical treatment. And again, that's going to choose A3 as the optimal solution. Okay, so that is a very brief introduction to multi-objective RL. And even with that, I think I've used most of my time. So just move on as quickly as I can through the second part. We then started applying some of these ideas in the context of safety. So we've got an environment, we've got a primary reward that the agent wants to optimize, and we've defined a safety-related or alignment reward as well, and we're using variations on that thresholded lexicographic ordering as a way of dealing with this. So I'll skip over these next few slides because there's a fair bit of detail here that doesn't really matter too much. Basically, what we did was to say, from an experimental perspective, I've got a primary reward, which is what I would normally give to the agent. And I've got this associated true reward, R star, which is our what we actually want the agent to achieve. And so what we're essentially modeling here is a situation where the agent, the reward it's being given, is not perfectly aligned with what we actually care about as measured by this R star. So the agent's going to try to maximize RP, and we're going to see to what extent that also results in it maximizing R star. We've checked a few different approaches. We've done just a basic single objective agent where all it does is maximize RP and it ignores any other criteria. And then 5 different multi-objective agents where they're considering both of these reward factors. And we've checked it on 4 different problems, a couple which involve picking up and carrying bottles from a location, a start location to a destination. And in these problems, there's a chance if you try to carry 2 bottles at once, it's obviously faster, which is good with regards to the primary reward, but there's a slight risk of dropping them. Now, one problem, the bottles are plastic, so if you drop one, it's not a disaster, you just pick it up again. In the second example, the bottles are glass, so if you drop a bottle, it smashes, and that's a permanent change. It's something the agent can't undo. And what we were hoping is we would see slightly different behavior from the agent based on which of those situations it was dealing with. There's an animation of it here, but I'm going to have to skip over that. We looked at a task that had been proposed in the AI safety literature. So this is just a Sokoban classic block pushing puzzle. So we've got our agent here, wants to get to our goal location down here, needs to push the box out of the way. Now in the simplest solution, the shortest one, the agent basically just pushes the box down and then goes straight to the goal, which is a very quick solution, but look at that box now, there's no way it can be moved away from the wall. It's stuck in that location now, which is probably undesirable. So we want to see, can our agent be encouraged to learn a safer solution where it takes quite a bit longer, but it leaves the box back in its original location. Fourth problem, similar sort of thing again. We've got a bit of a grid world here, loop shaped. We want the agent to get from S to G, and there's a couple of doors that can be opened and closed. So again, there's a short solution, just go through the doors, don't bother wasting time closing them, get to the goal as quickly as possible. Very good for the primary reward, not very good in terms of not having an impact on the environment. There's 2 policies which are good in terms of not changing the environment. One's to walk all the way around the outside, never open the doors so we don't have to worry about closing them. But the solution we'd really like the agent to find, the one that we would see as being the best trade-off, is go through the doors but close them behind yourself. So it's not as fast as the one at the top, but it's not as slow as the one in the middle, and it still leaves the environment unchanged. So we ran a whole bunch of agents through this. I could probably spend half an hour just talking through these results. So let's try and do this as quickly as we can. So at the top, we've got the single objective agent. You can see it generally does a pretty good job in terms of the RP value. So in terms of primary reward, it's good. In terms of our alignment reward, it's generally not so good because it doesn't know anything about that. So it just chooses what it finds as the simplest, fastest solution. And if that means leaving parts of the environment changed, broken bottles lying on the ground and the box shoved up against a wall and the doors open, that's exactly what it does. So its scores relative to R star on most of these problems are pretty dreadful. Really, the only one where it works well is the unbreakable bottles. And that's because if it drops a bottle, it can pick it back up again. It turns out in that case, the policy that's optimal with regards to RP is also optimal with regards to R star. So then we tried a few different versions of our multi-objective agents. There's a couple here, LEX-P and LEX-A, were applied without using thresholding, and they really didn't do very well at all. Essentially, LEX-P just ignores the safety reward for the most part. LEX-A does the opposite and focuses so much on safety that often it doesn't actually complete the main task at all. Where we had a bit more success was with these three at the bottom here. So here we're applying thresholding to those things. So TLOP thresholds the primary reward, says, okay, I want to be at least this good on the primary reward. And after that, I don't care about optimizing any further. At that point, I'll care about being safe. So it's what you might refer to as a satisficing agent rather than a maximizing agent. TLOA does the same sort of thing, but the other way around. So it says, I want to be at least this safe. I'm only going to accept a certain amount of risk. And then after I've done that, I'll care about maximizing the primary reward. And then TLOPA is a bit of a combination of both of those to take into account an issue that I probably don't have time to talk about today. The main thing you can see here is that TLOA, all the black bolded numbers here, actually performed optimally on all of the tasks that we found. It came up with no errors with regards to the safety or alignment rewards, and it did so while still finding the best possible primary solution that could be achieved while still being safe. TLOPA does basically the same thing, but it's a little bit slower during the learning phase. And I think I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm just going to skip ahead. Find my list of slides to my final, okay, it was next slide anyway. Conclusion. So basically, RL agents won't be human aligned unless we actually tell them to do it. We're going to have to provide rewards to encourage them to be human aligned. Otherwise, they'll just maximize the reward they're given. I think we can design suitable rewards for those aspects of human alignment, but if we just add them together and give them to a single objective agent, we're probably not going to get the trade-off that we want. Multi-objective agents give us much more control over that trade-off between those two factors. And we've shown that, with our safety example, it is possible to actually get the sort of trade-offs that we want, at least on those simple toy problems. We obviously need to extend these out to more complicated domains. And I'd say, of course, that multi-objective reinforcement learning itself is a fairly new area. We don't have the same quality of algorithms there that we have in single objective RL yet. So there's still quite a lot of work to be done on those kind of foundational algorithms before we can really solve the alignment problems as well. But I think this is an area worth looking at. Okay, and I better wrap things up at that point. So thanks everyone for listening in. And are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much for the presentation. Actually, I think this is quite interesting, especially from a developmental learning perspective. I mean, we cognitive agents all the time. We don't use the scalar reward. Actually, we probably do more multi-objective reinforcement learning. So thank you again for your talk. I think we have time for a quick question. There is one in the chat, actually, you mentioned. Yeah, so the question is, can a reward from an external factor could be considered? For example, the car following the law more than just not hurting people, and for the medical situation, a family member or next of kin deciding the medical treatment surgery of the person in an emergency situation, for example, or all of this would be considered as alignment reward too?
Yeah, I think one of the things I like about this approach to alignment rewards is it naturally scales up to including more than one alignment reward. So the example I've shown here, there's only the one for the safety task, but the multi-objective model, at least in theory, you could have as many of these rewards as you care about, and just combine them together in this non-linear fashion. Practically, there are going to be issues as you add more and more objectives you care about. The computational cost of doing this is going to blow out, and we don't really have much yet that can deal with more than maybe 3 or 4 objectives.
Okay, so Peter, I think this concept of impact minimization is actually quite interesting. So a question I had about that is, how at the moment can you identify if an action can be undone or not, actually, because I guess not all the actions that can be actually reversed.
Yeah, and so I mean, one of the issues with reinforcement learning, of course, is if you go with a pure blank slate type of approach, you don't know if something is dangerous until you try it. So our agent actually has to break a bottle and then try to pick it up before it realizes that breaking the bottle is a bad idea. And so if we're going to build practical systems, things like transfer learning are going to be very important. Can I take what I've learned about safety and common sense on one task and apply that when I do something new?
Yeah, but in that regard, actually, I believe that it's quite aligned again with developmental learning, pretty much like children. They destroy stuff somewhere,
Yep.
and then they learn, it's like, yes.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much again, Peter, for your talk. Yeah, I think if there is any other question, probably we can take it offline. I think we are going to move on to the next speakers. Thank you again, Peter.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so Cornelius, are you there?
Yes,